Hi guys, welcome back. And this week we're going to be taking a look at feedback. So every time we do a formative or summative assessment, we should be using feedback cycles with students, and we want to talk about what those are and get into some of those details. So this talk is going to have 4 different areas that we look at. We're going to look at the process for giving feedback. We're going to look at the art of giving feedback. We're going to look at the student's perspective of feedback, and then we're going to talk about what feedback is useful for us in our teaching practices. So let's jump right into the first one of these, which is the process. So when we're thinking about feedback, we need to understand that feedback is something that should be continual. It's an ongoing process in the classroom, and it should pretty much extend the entire school year. There should never be a time period in which you're not giving feedback or in which students aren't responding to feedback. That should just be something that naturally happens through the instruction. And feedback always needs to be attached to learning. A key point of that is that students have to have an opportunity to act on feedback before receiving a score. I want to really emphasize this just for a second. Anytime you write comments or give any type of feedback to a student on an assignment that has been graded, that they are not going to improve, everything that you've said is useless. Nothing that you say after you give a score is going to really impact a student's ability to perform a skill. All of that feedback has to be given before the assessment is scored. So, and that's going to lead us into the next part, which is what the feedback loop cycle looks like. We want to be in the cycle where students are learning in the classroom, and then they try a skill, they receive feedback on it, and they learn from that feedback and improve. And then they try it again, and they receive feedback, and they learn from that feedback and improve, and so on. So they continue along this cycle, and this is the feedback loop cycle that enables students to be successful at things. One of the ways that I think about this in my own personal classroom is this concept of at-bats. And this comes from an approach taught by Teach Like a Champion. Teach Like a Champion is a great teaching resource that has a lot of different philosophical approaches and practical exercises that teachers can do in the classroom in order to strengthen everything from behavior management to classroom cohesion. And one of the things that they talk about is this concept of at-bats, which means that the chances of success at a skill is directly correlated to the number of times that a skill has been attempted, combined with the quality of feedback that's been provided. Now in sports, this is called practice and coaching. For some reason, we don't think about it like this in the classroom, but it certainly would help. You think about the number of times that a batter goes and practices batting in order to get good at that skill. The same thing is true of almost any skill that we teach in the classroom. If we want students to be able to write a paragraph really well, they need a lot of at-bats at that. They need a lot of practice. If we want students to be able to apply mathematical rules, they need a lot of at-bats at that. They need a lot of practice. The more practice we provide for students and the more coaching we give them in between those practices, the more they're going to improve. And that idea is a lot more in sync with the philosophy of instruction that modern teaching is really about. So think about that feedback loop cycle and think about how we are using that in order to create opportunities for students to have additional practice and to learn from the coaching that we're providing them on those skills as they move along on their learning journeys. The next thing that we want to talk about is the art of giving feedback. Now there's going to be another video that I'm going to have you watch about this. It's a TED Talk. And then we're going to practice this actually in our session on Thursday. So let's take a look at what this process is. The first step in giving effective feedback is preparing the mind to give feedback. A lot of times if we just jump into telling a student what to do, their minds are not ready to receive that feedback and they will reject it or they will close off. So it's really important that we prepare them for receiving feedback and say, okay, I'm going to give you some feedback on this. Are you ready? Don't take it personally, but this is all in an effort to try and help you improve. And once we say that to a student, we've kind of disarmed the threat that the student feels from this critical interaction that we're having. The next step is to make observations and not value judgments. So I'm never going to tell a student your punctuation is really good here and it's bad here. Instead, I'm going to say, I noticed that at the beginning of your paragraphs, you were using the full stop correctly on the inside of your quotation marks, but then later on, you started to use the full stop on the outside of the quotation marks. I also noticed that you started your story writing it in past tense, but later on in the story, it turned into something that was in present tense. So I haven't told them that they did a good or bad job. Instead, I just made observations about what I see on the page. The next step is to talk about the implications or the impact of those observations. And I can talk about how certain uses of language might confuse a reader, or I might talk about how the incorrect application of a particular formula led to an incorrect outcome. By talking about the impact of the observations that I'm making rather than the value, I'm allowing the students to draw their own conclusions about why a certain practice was good or bad. And lastly, the thing that I want to do is I want to ask questions. Things like, what do you think that you should do in order to do this better next time? And allow students to draw their own conclusions and set their own learning goals. So that's the art of giving feedback. And this takes a lot of mindful practice when you're in the middle of a conversation with a student to bring yourself back to this process. The next thing that we want to talk about is student perspectives of feedback. So these are some things we want to keep in mind. First is that we really want to help the learner understand where they are in their learning journey. And by giving observational feedback, it really helps them do that. It helps them construct in their mind what specifically they need to do to improve in order to get to where they want to be going. Because our goal is to help them understand where they are in the learning journey and not to judge them, we don't want to make evaluative statements on the student themselves. We don't want to say things like, you're really smart or you're doing a really awesome job. Those types of comments really appeal to a student's ego, but it doesn't actually help them improve their performance at all. So we want to hold back from that type of ego-driven praise. It doesn't help learning. Next is we really want the students to feel that they are in collaboration with the teachers to help them improve. The teacher is not there just as a judge to constantly evaluate them, but the teacher is there as a mentor and a coach and somebody to collaborate with on their learning journey. Next, we want to be specific about what students need to change. The more specific feedback, the better. And we want to make feedback digestible. Don't overload the students. I've been guilty of this in the past, especially at the beginning of my teaching career, when a student would write a paper and I would give those papers back to students just marked in red all over, correcting their grammar, correcting their logic, correcting everything that I didn't like about their paper, and students just took one look at it and just wanted to throw it in the trash. It didn't help them at all. One last little extra bit I want to throw in here. It's not quite as applicable to written feedback and to assessment feedback, but in classroom discussions, I would say don't evaluate responses from students. So if you ask the class a question and you have a student raise their hand and you call on them and they give you a good response, you don't want to say, I like that response. Don't have any reaction at all. I just kind of nod my head and say, and I go to the next person. This drives my students crazy, but it also gets better responses from them. So I don't want to tell a student that what they said is necessarily good or bad. The last big idea that I want to focus on is that feedback is an integral part of you as a teacher. Giving feedback is part of your iterative improvement process as a teacher. Iterative means that you do it over and over and over. We teach the same thing every year, and the idea is that we improve it every year, and we get better at every year. And so giving feedback helps us do that because while we are giving the students feedback, we're able to see where the gaps are in their understanding. And their gaps in understanding tell us where the gaps are in our curriculum, in our lessons, in our teaching. Seeing the trends in student mistakes and in student successes inform us about what needs to be strengthened and what needs to be focused more on in our classrooms. And getting a clear view of what students are doing well and what they need to improve helps us predict misunderstandings and address them before they occur next year. So that's it for feedback. I feel like this video is deceptively short because each one of the things that I talked about actually could go much, much deeper. But here's the key takeaway, is that feedback is a cornerstone of modern instruction. It helps students learn and it advances our professional improvement every single year. So I hope that helps you understand feedback and apply it a little better in your classroom. And I look forward to our activity on Thursday where we'll do a little bit of practice giving feedback.